Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine distributed by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Find us online at virginiainstitute.org. My name is Joe Thomas, and for decades, we have been sharing the information of what's going on in and around the Commonwealth and best ways and best practices. Even during this time of social distancing, we can still get the message to you because of radio. And thank you to all of our affiliates around the Commonwealth and on our podcast channel, where you can download previous episodes at youtube.com and then search Freedom and Prosperity Radio. One of the things you're hearing an awful lot of during this crisis are governors and mayors talking about nationalizing things and taking over, and it would be temporary, and it's for your own good, and we need to help, and rhetoric like that. And unfortunately, that usually leads to bad places. Our first guest has written a great piece on the government takeover of consumer lending and price controls in general. He is Phil Kerpen. He is president of American Commitment. You can read more about it at americancommitment.org. Good morning, Phil. I hope you are well, and thanks for joining us this week.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So, the argument, and maybe this is cyclical, and all free societies eventually wind up into a place of enough prosperity to have forgotten the freedoms that have led them there, and little by little of regulatory capture and the use of precedent to say, oh, look at what we did here, and you let us do this little thing here, so we're just going to expound on the things you let us do 10 years ago, that kind of thing, especially right now as people are looking at 2 or 3 months of maybe not earning an income, maybe if the unemployment gets up there, or their businesses are shut down for 2 or 3 months for the coronavirus. The government is saying maybe we should take this over, and it's a dangerous place, isn't it?
Well, it's always crises when the size and scope and intrusiveness of government is ratcheted up most severely, typically. Economic depressions and wars are the big sort of pivot points where government ratchets up its power, but a public health crisis can work that function as well. And of course, in this particular circumstance, we've got a public health crisis response which is kind of deliberately inducing a recession, maybe even a depression, because we're shutting down so much economic activity in the name of trying to limit transmission of the virus. And of course, that in turn leads to calls for vast government interventions in the economy to try to soften that blow. And I think there's something to be said for some of these extraordinary measures as near-term measures. While you're in the public health crisis, the danger from a limited government free market standpoint is that things end up not being temporary, that you have a permanent ratchet up in the size, scope, power, and intrusiveness of government. And the interesting thing, I think, Joe, about the current situation, the current crisis that we're in, is that we've sort of got dual impulses. We've got sort of big government and anti-big government headlines all over the place, in that while you have all of these efforts at the Fed and in Congress to sort of float the economy with loans and grants and extraordinary levels of spending and so forth while things are largely shut down, you also have story after story after story of stupid, unnecessary and harmful regulations being suspended in the breach. All kinds of FDA rules, CDC rules that slowed the development and rollout of testing, for instance, have been suspended. The FDA is moving at lightning speed for them to get things approved and through, things they said they never could do. We're now allowing billable encounters with doctors in telemedicine, which we were told, forever just couldn't be done, and the insurance companies were against, and everyone was against. Now it's happening. We're seeing remarkable innovation in distance learning, things the teachers' unions under an ordinary circumstance would never agree to. And so we've got things sort of cutting in both directions. And I think the big challenge, other than, resolving this, getting the virus under control, returning to some semblance of normal life in this country, is going to be trying to learn the right lessons, and the lessons that while there is a role for government in crisis response, a lot of the things that government was already doing and doing all the time was not only unnecessary but was very harmful. And so I think that's the debate we're going to have when we get through this sort of acute period that we're in right now.
Phil, one of the things that I've heard, and Bill de Blasio of New York mentioned it, Andrew Cuomo, after saying nice things about the president at the next press conference he talks about nationalizing some industries to make sure things were going to happen. And we see that rhetoric actually predate coronavirus in the political campaigns. And I'm certainly, if you want an example of how to demagogue something, look at the Senate this past week. But the idea of free college tuition, student loans, that kind of thing. That stuff has now all of a sudden been folded into the argument over these corporatizations, these government takeovers, this democratic capitalism that the government all of a sudden wants to deal in. I'm happy to see some political parties are against it, but is this the first step towards normalizing that kind of conversation?
Well, I think that what we're seeing right now with Nancy Pelosi and a lot of the sort of the far left of the Democratic Party is they want to go back to the old, Rahm Emanuel adage about not letting a crisis go to waste. And so we're seeing a lot of their sort of pre-existing ideological agenda try to hitch a ride on emergency measures. And I do think that's very dangerous. And, and to your point, this article that we were supposed to be talking about where I wrote about how they want to basically cripple consumer lending in the private sector and have the post office take over making loans. Well, Democrats were trying to do that before this virus hit, before there was any discussion of emergency measures. And so, I think that there's this impulse in the Democratic Party these days to have government take over as much of everything as they possibly can. And, the challenge is when you're up against opponents who are ideologically committed to making something happen using, whatever pretext they can, it's very difficult to engage in a good faith process of doing sort of emergency response. And I think that we saw that when, the Senate spent all weekend negotiating on a bipartisan basis. Nancy Pelosi flew in at the last minute and said, not unless you give me this whole list of, ideological wish list items.
Right. Well, and I was getting to the article. I was kind of bringing in the current events and leading up to what had been a campaign football for some time. It's this, I guess the market-based price controls meets, debt relief, and it's this crazy place where politicians are saying we want to be able to help you get credit, and or erase your student debt or your credit debt, and we're going to institute price controls. First and foremost, when I hear price controls, the presumption is that the prices are out of control. Are there, people gouging at credit rates that we would need the government to intercede in some other way than to just arrest them for fraud or bad violation of the public trust? I just don't see where somebody is overcharging in some ridiculous way for credit right now, Phil.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, credit cards have pretty high interest rates in general, but they also have, all sorts of perks and deals and cash back and all kinds of other stuff. And, you need to understand what you're agreeing to. And at the same time that they kind of generally have pretty high interest rates, they also run a lot of promotional rates. And you can find 0% rates and all this kind of thing. And so there's no shortage of competition in the credit card market. And the idea of putting a heavy government price control and a price cap on what interest they can charge, well, a lot of people would no longer be able to get credit cards at all if their default risk is too high for the interest, to fall under the interest rate cap set by government, and everyone else would probably lose a lot of the perks and benefits that they enjoy. And of course, the proposals that we've seen from people like Bernie Sanders and Maxine Waters are not just for credit cards. They also want to cap installment loans, appliance purchase loans, short-term emergency loans like payday and vehicle title loans and all of that kind of stuff. And, if you look at some of those products on an annualized percentage rate basis, which is how the Democrats want to do it, they do look like astronomical rates. But you can't look at an annual percentage rate basis for a loan that is 2 weeks or a month.
Right.
Because if you cap it on an annual basis, then you got to divide that rate by 12 or by 26 or by 52 or whatever it is for what the government's going to let you charge. And so for a standard like 1 or 2 week payday loan where they're charging you $15 per 100 borrowed typically, well, they're going to say that's not 15% because you got to like divide you got to multiply the interest rate out by 26 on that 2 week loan to get the annual interest rate, and so it's actually 300 or 400%. And how dare you? This is outrageous, and so forth. But if you insist on looking at it that way, you're going to impose a rate cap that basically outlaws that business. Because if all you can charge, inclusive of fees and so forth, is $1 or $2 per $100, because they're going to multiply your rate out to get an annualized rate. Well, you're not going to be able to pay your rent. You're not going to be able to pay your employees. You're not going to be able to have any, you can't make the math work. And so you basically ban that business. Well, what happens to people who are in a desperate circumstance who still need access to a loan when you've banned that business? They either go to a criminal enterprise of some kind, or they end up with a government program that replaces what used to be done in the private sector. And, of course, that's what Bernie Sanders wants. He wants consumer lending to all move to the post office. Of course, if the post office is making loans at sort of capped government-set interest rates where they can't cover their default risk, they're going to rack up billions and billions of dollars of losses, and at some point be bailed out by taxpayers. And so it's a ridiculous kind of thing. I hope it doesn't go anywhere. In the context of everything that's going on right now with these emergency packages, it seems small because it's billions, and we're thinking trillions right now. But it's still very considerable, and it would create another political football, just like what they've done with student lending. Remember, student lending used to all be in the private sector. They had government take it over in the Obamacare bill, in the sidecar Obamacare bill. They federalized all of student lending. And then they immediately started saying, well, we need to forgive all those loans. Just wipe them off the books, have taxpayers absorb the losses. I think if government takes over consumer lending, we would have the exact same thing. They would almost immediately start saying, let's just wipe this out, let taxpayers absorb the losses.
Well, you mentioned something in there. Phil Kerpen is on with us, president of American Commitment. He's got a great piece. We've got it linked up at virginiainstitute.org as well. You mentioned the idea of this is to, in Bernie Sanders' case, crash the system and just have a government single option socialist model where we all pitch in and we become the bank and we become the electric company and we become the hospital system, and then I guess his vision is then we all vote on the things we want. This has been the bane of every democracy ever. But when you talk about price controls, your column is brilliant at the opening, because when we see price controls on consumer goods, as you say, it leads to shortages and disaster and economic collapse. The same can be said for these banking institutions, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, every time you have price controls, you have shortages. And, of course, there are the obvious evocative examples like the gas lines and that kind of thing. And then there are sort of less obvious examples like, the countries that impose price controls on prescription drugs, which is another thing Democrats want to copy in this country. Even right now, while we're hoping that industry will save the world, they don't have new drugs the way we do. They don't have access to medicines the way we do. They typically don't get things until years later, so they have shortages of new cures, of new treatments. And anytime you impose a price control, and the same thing happens with rent control. The cities that have rent control have a chronic housing shortage because, who's going to build more housing units when the price is going to be set by government at a below market rate? And so we have these chronic problems in cities with rent control, and yet, same thing, Bernie wants that national rent control. And so the thing about price controls is they're so seductive politically, because when people feel a pain point, when they're paying a lot for something, you can say, I'm going to mandate that it be less expensive. And that's very easy to grasp, very intuitive, politically attractive. But the economics of it don't work, because prices in a market system convey information. They allow markets to clear. And so when government steps in and says we're going to suppress a price below its market level, it prevents the market from clearing, and then you have a shortage of supply. And the same thing happens in financial instruments. And so if you cap credit rates, if you cap interest rates, you're essentially imposing a price control that will result in less credit being available. And the same principle, by the way, applies to these calls we're seeing to put price controls on emergency goods and supplies. And I'm all for, in a crisis like this, spending what we have to spend to get personal protective equipment for all of our frontline healthcare workers and so forth. But when Governor Cuomo says, why are we paying so much more for this than we used to pay? The government should the federal government should step in and set the price back to what it used to be before this crisis. That's a very dangerous idea, because we want as much of this stuff to be produced as quickly as it possibly can be produced. And that means you have to let the price rise, so that factories are going to go 24/7, so they're going to source where their inputs wherever they possibly can. And if that makes them more expensive, then we need to pay that price. But we shouldn't be imposing price controls. The consequences of that will actually undermine what we're trying to accomplish.
Is anyone out there successfully debunking this, fraudulent premise of price controls? I believe, to a lot of people's surprise, the president, when he was elected, was way tougher on that than people expected him to be, because he had no track record of it. And I guess that's a lot of what made the president compelling, is he was a wild card and you didn't know how conservatively he'd govern. But is he isn't listening to any of this stuff out of compassion or an appearance that he wants to be seen as doing something or anything like that, is he, Phil?
Well, look, I think that the president is very pragmatic, and he's not necessarily ideological. And so I do worry that on some of these things he may go for price controls. I think certainly prescription drug price controls have had some attractiveness to him, because he doesn't like that other countries get drugs cheaper than we do. He thinks that's unfair, which he's right, by the way. But you don't solve that by copying the bad policies they have for yourselves. You solve it by breaking their bad policies, getting them to have market pricing in other countries through trade negotiations. So I do worry a little bit that, especially during crisis response, he's going to just say, we need to impose price controls, we need to get things cheaper, or what have you. But that hasn't happened so far, and so, we'll see. I think his instincts on most things have got him to the right place eventually, even if sometimes he says the wrong thing.
Well, so where is the future of this? Is it going to get worse before it gets better? And I'm not speaking about the coronavirus specifically, but given the fact that, as you mentioned, Rahm Emanuel and Saul Alinsky and Let No Crisis Go to Waste, they're doubling down on it. Does Joe Biden pick up the handle of this price control, even though he never really was that guy just to woo over Bernie's voters?
Well, I think he's adopted almost all of the Sanders agenda, and the Democratic Party's moved very, very far left. And, frankly, the idea that the Obama presidency could be called moderate by anyone with a straight face, I think tells you a lot about what's happened to their party over just the past couple of years, because they had a very, very far left by any objective standard administration, and they had a huge wing of their party that said it wasn't far enough. We want outright socialism. And Biden's challenge is now that he's got to sort of find a couple of steps to move even further left than Obama was, which it is very hard to do, and keep any real semblance of a market system. And of course, we don't even know what next year is going to look like. What's going to be left of the economy and our market system. We've got to get through this crisis and sort of see what's left. But as of right now, most of the country is not even going to work right now.
Well, and certainly, going around and trying to dissuade fears that in a lot of ways the media has helped gin up out of clickbait and the desperate need to get tune-ins and click-throughs is not helping either, as we seem hell-bent on ginning up a crowd of less miserables to storm the Bastille these days, Philip. But I greatly appreciate the column. Again, we're sharing it at Freedom and Prosperity Radio's website, virginiainstitute.org. There'll also be a link by our podcast of this interview on YouTube as well. What are you working on? Does this continue? Are you going to continue writing on this, or are there other things in the pipeline at American Commitment?
Well, right now I'm really I'm a little more focused on the other hat I wear, which is with the Committee to Unleash Prosperity with Steve Moore and Art Laffer, and I'm trying to develop our our economic strategy on the public health crisis and how to get the economy back open while not undermining our public health efforts to contain the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So that's I'm probably going to have a paper out on that soon, and that's really, I think, the most immediate and urgent need right now from an economic policy standpoint.
Well, you're not kidding. Well, if there was a Mount Rushmore of economic thinkers, certainly Adam Smith would be there, but there along with it would be Steve and Art and you, Phil. I appreciate it taking some time out with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Coming up next, Mark Mix, president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, on bills that are heading to the governor that are going to start chipping away at right to work in the Commonwealth on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.